For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ian Wilson, and I serve, as of July 1, I just started as director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life here at Augustana. This morning, I'd like to speak just a bit about Ronning himself, which I realize may be somewhat ironic because I obviously didn't know him, and some of you did. So maybe some of you should be giving this talk and speaking a bit about Ronning's life. But I would like to say a bit about his legacy, about how that legacy carries on in the center that bears his name. And I'm also going to show part of the 1980 film China Mission. So it's a movie day. When I have classes and they show up and I say, "Movie day," they get really excited and clap because then it means they don't have to listen to me talk. But unfortunately, I'm going to talk just a bit, and then we will watch a portion of the film China Mission. So I do have something of a preamble here, but soon we'll settle into the movie. Since I began working at the Ronning Center last year, a number of people have suggested to me that we should host a screening of the 1980 film China Mission, directed by Tom Radford and produced by the National Film Board of Canada. I thought about how we should do this morning, different ways. I thought about maybe showing clips and commenting as I show various clips, but instead I've decided that we'll just watch the first part of the film in its entirety. Unfortunately, we don't have time to watch the whole film. I promised Craig Wentland that I would get you out of here in plenty of time to go to the chapel service at 10:30. And also, I should mention as well, there are other events going on right now. I believe they're giving tours of Founders Hall. So I'm not sure. We should be done here around 10 or so. But if you have time, if you wanted to go see Founders, if you haven't had a chance to do that, you probably will have time to sneak over there and look around before coming back for Reverend Wentland's chapel service. So today we're going to watch part of the film. As I've already said, I never knew Ronning personally, but I've gotten to know his memory through this film. And also through, I have some goodies down here, also through Evans's biography of Ronning, The Remarkable Chester Ronning, also through Ronning's own memoir, Memoir of China in Revolution, and through various stories that alumni have shared with me, as well as newspaper clippings and photos that we have out at his old home over on 49th Street, which is where my office and Diane's office is. Please stop by when and if you're in the area. Ronning was, of course, a cowboy and a farmer, a musician, a singer, a choral director, and a politician and diplomat, among other things. He's famous, at least around these parts, and in those working in the Foreign Service in Ottawa, for rubbing shoulders with Enlai and Mao in China, with Nehru in India, and with the Norwegian royal family in the 1950s. And also for leading covert peace talks in Vietnam in 1965 and 66. The failure of those peace missions in Vietnam and his ongoing frustration with Canada's and the United States' refusal to recognize China's communist government led him to become a vocal critic of Western foreign policy and a public advocate for the People's Republic of China in the closing decades of his life. All of this, I'm sure most of you know well, and all of it is documented at length in the sources I've mentioned, the film, the biographies, and memoir, etc. But in viewing and thinking about the film China Mission, the thing that really strikes me is Ronning's life as a teacher and educator. To be a good teacher, one has to be a good learner. An effective educator constantly learns, is committed to the never-ending process of learning. There's a Ronning quote, and he first says it in Chinese, so I'm not sure. It might be a Chinese proverb, I'm not entirely sure. But there's a Ronning quote from the film that I love. You'll hear it at least a couple times in the film, and I'd also like to read it for you now, just to begin our thinking here. It goes like this: "Live until you're old, learn until you're old, and there is still so much to learn." This, I think, captures what Chester Ronning was all about. Radford frames his documentary with this quote, and Evans, in his biography, repeatedly emphasizes Ronning's love for learning. Chester was zealous in his advocacy for lifelong democratic education. Ronning served as a teacher and administrator at primary and secondary schools in Valhalla and Edmonton, and, as you all know, was principal of Camrose Lutheran College for more than a decade. His diplomatic work gets most of the attention from historians and the like because it was challenging and high profile and sometimes even glamorous. We have photos of Chester and his wife Ingo with the Queen and Prince Philip and so on. But I think if you really want to know something about Ronning, you should get to know his passion for learning. You may or may not know that Ronning wrote a 245-page master's thesis at the University of Alberta entitled A Study of an Alberta Protestant Private School. This is a hefty thesis for the 1940s, and actually a master's thesis for any day. I think the average research institution master's thesis is maybe 100 to 150 pages. My own master's thesis was only 80 pages. So this is quite the work. I have friends whose doctoral dissertations were roughly this length. And we have a copy of it here in our library, and I'm sure there are other copies of it floating around in the university system. But there it is. The thesis makes a case for the necessity of schools like the CLC within Alberta's education system in the 1940s. But its overarching theme is that education should be all about democracy, and democracy about education. He follows the thought of the famous psychologist, philosopher, and educational theorist John Dewey, arguing that democracy is not only a form of government, but a way of social life, and that education is at the foundation of such a life. Moreover, for Dewey and for Ronning, in a democratic society, it is not enough for all people to have the right to access education. For a society to be truly democratic, according to their thinking, its people, all of them, must collectively and actively participate in the educational process. I won't carry on about educational and social theory, but I would like us to keep this in mind as we view the first part of China Mission. Ronning was largely responsible for shaping the Camrose Lutheran College as an institution that focused on a liberal education for anyone and everyone, rather than just being a parochial Norwegian Lutheran school. When you come across references to Ronning and read accounts of his life, and I mean in accounts other than these more focused, the film and the biography and so on, you don't hear much about this aspect of his character or his concerns. Again, mostly I read about his friendships with Enlai and Nehru, or his political work with the United Farmers of Alberta and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which were forerunners to today's NDP. For example, if you go to his Wikipedia page, it lists his career as politician and diplomat and doesn't mention anything about being a teacher or a principal, a school principal. But his love for education was essential to who he was and what he did with his life. And that's what I'd like us to keep in mind as we view the film. So now I will start the film. I'll move this out of the way so it won't block anyone's view. And I will try to monitor sound, and if anyone in the back after the first minute or so can't hear, just wave at me and I'll try to adjust the volume. So without further ado.
Ian, can you knock these curtains down too?
Yes.
Okay.
You know how I used to put you to sleep?
Tell me.
At the bottom of your foot like that.
August 1978. A family reunion on the shores of Great Spirit Lake, Iowa. This is Chester Ronning, 85 years old. He's preparing for the baptism of his great-grandchild. Their ancestors were Norwegians, part of the great immigration that poured into the American West in the 1870s.
One, two, three.
Chester's been everything in his life, from a cowboy to an internationally known diplomat. A man of many parts. But most significantly, he's been a teacher. Chester's younger brother, Talbot, 80, is an active Lutheran minister in Chicago. They grew up together 8,000 miles from here in the oldest civilization on Earth, Imperial China. He's saying, live until you're old, learn until you're old. And there's still so much to learn. Chester lives in Camrose, Alberta, a small farming community 100 miles southeast of Edmonton, in a house he helped build 50 years ago. Once a month, children visit him from the local school as part of their social studies classes.
And the painting is judged on the basis of how light they can handle and how heavy they can handle the brush. But every leaf is just one stroke. And you see the difference between that stroke, that stroke, and this stroke? You see the difference between that stroke and these strokes? And see the knots here are left? Now, here are modern Chinese paintings. This, I say, is the grandfather. And he is not too interested in life, is he? He's quiet. And there's his son. That would be something like your parents. They take some interest in life. And here you are. And do you see how lively they are?
Yeah.
Are you as lively as that?
Yeah.
The attic of his house is a store of treasures. Photographs, rare porcelains, the tiger he shot with a Maharaja.
I have an annoying habit of pausing films and editorializing when I show them in class, but I have to stop just once here because the legend of this tiger lives on. I still have people ask me, because my office is in this house, right? And Diane as well, I think, has had this question, right? So how's the tiger doing? Or can we go up to the attic to see the tiger? And unfortunately, just to let you all know, we don't have the tiger anymore. I'm not sure where most of this stuff is. I'm sure it's with Roning's extended family, but just wanted to let you know that if you stop by the Roning house, unfortunately, I won't be able to take you up to the attic and show you the tiger.
But the real treasures are the memories of a life. Norway, India, Vietnam, China. Chester's parents, Hannah and Halva Roning, Lutheran missionaries, arrived on the China coast in December of 1891. Their destination, 700 miles up the Yangtze River, was the city of Hankou, where they were to learn Chinese. Hannah and Halva set out on a 6-week journey by junk up the treacherous Han River. They wanted to set up a mission deep in the interior, in the old China. A 4,000-year-old civilization that saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, halfway between heaven and earth. Halva wrote home to his brother. What a multitude of people, and all of them heathen. Brother, you can hardly believe how hard it is to travel past thousands and millions of fellow beings who as yet know nothing of their Savior. Often we fall on our knees out in the open and pray for these people. But to the Chinese, it was the missionaries who were the barbarians. How could these strangers ever understand the time-revered codes which ennobled Chinese life? They founded their mission in the ancient walled city of Fancheng. Within 3 years, they had built a church, a school, and a home. Here, 6 children were born. 4 of them attended the family reunion in Iowa.
"一个老头儿88，先长胡子后长牙，是什么东西？你猜得到？猜不到？"
What is an old man who first grows whiskers before he grows teeth?
一个老头儿88，先长胡子后长牙，是什么东西？你猜，你猜，你猜，包谷不对了，对了。
The answer? Corn.
There we have Ni Guixing, what is your name? And the last name comes first, and the given name second. So it's Zhang Hongen. Hongen means grace. The Hong character is the vastness, like the vast ocean. And Un means grace. So we have here Hongen, the grace of God. And that was the name that Father gave our mission in China, Hong Ren Hui.
Unlike most missionaries, they didn't impose Western ways. Instead, they adopted a Chinese way of life. Their dress was Chinese. In their home, they spoke Chinese. Chester was the first white baby born in Fancheng.
And my mother had no milk for me. And I was brought up on the breast of a Chinese woman. I suppose she brought her own baby into the house with her. And I had to share with him, whoever he was.
Hannah had been a school teacher in Iowa. In Fancheng, she spent long days preaching. But in 3 years, she only baptized 12 converts. Her real work was in education. The first women to enter a school in the region's history were in her classes. Chester and his brother Nelius were brought up by their milk mothers and the cook, who taught them the rhymes and riddles, the fables of a culture that predated the teachings of Confucius. Hannah took the 2 boys into the heart of Fancheng, the market. This was a China Chester would always love. The fascination of Chester's family for Chinese life was not widespread in the European community. In most missionary and trade circles, there was an undisguised contempt for the Chinese people.
It was a question of bringing the gospel to the heathen. And a lot of the people actually believed that all the Chinese who had lived for all of these generations, who had not received salvation and had not been baptized, they'd go to hell. And when I finally realized this as a youngster, I said to Father, how can God be so cruel as to damn all of those people to hell? And he said, oh no, he said, that's one way to get into heaven is to be baptized. But we don't know how many other ways there are. We understand only a little of one way.
Alva wrote home to his brother. Most of the country consists of large tracts of level and beautiful land. All sorts of grains grow here, most of it barley and wheat. There are many things reminding us of Palestine at the time of Christ. China had built the Great Wall to keep out foreigners. It didn't keep out the exploiters. In Shanghai, Hankow, Hong Kong, it was the golden age of imperialism. British, Germans, Americans, French, Japanese. They grew rich on China's immense supply of raw materials and cheap labor. They built streets and parks where signs read, Chinese and dogs not allowed. A fierce resentment was growing among the Chinese. Secret societies formed to expel the foreigner. The Order of Literary Patriotic Harmonious Fists, better known as the Boxers, threatened to drive the strangers into the sea. The missionaries, hundreds of miles away from the protection of foreign gunboats, were the first victims. Finally, the Board of Missions ordered the Ronings out of China.
Well, when we went down the river in junks, the Boxers marched towards the river. We heard them say, "Sa Yang Guizhu! Kill the foreign devils."
From Shanghai, they sailed around the world, to Norway, visiting the home of their forefathers. Chester and Nelius learned 2 new languages, English and Norwegian. The news from China was very bad. The Boxer Rebellion was raging, churches were being sacked, missionaries murdered. But when a shaky peace was restored in China, they began the long journey back. Now a boy of 7, Chester was back home. Mandarins ruled with an iron grip.
Nelius and I would often run to the city wall when it was announced that there would be chopping of heads. There would be one man that was the executioner. The prisoners who were to be executed were like this. Oh, it was so distressing to see what they actually did. No, I never got accustomed to that. I shudder now when I see this picture.
The Western powers had brutally suppressed the Boxer Rebellion, protecting their own privileged position. This corruption and oppression was becoming intolerable, especially to the youth of China. A revolutionary movement inspired by Dr. Sun Yat-sen was sweeping the country. The students at the mission studied more than the Bible. Many had memorized the American Declaration of Independence before they could speak English.
The students in my father's school were young revolutionaries. They brought Neelius and me into their meetings. When we learned that they were proposing to throw out the Manchu government, we said, hadn't we better inform our father about this? They called him Lo with old whiskers. Oh, no, don't you say anything to him, said Deng Zipei, who was the leader of the group.
Halva's answer to China's problems was education. Other missionaries concentrated on medical work. Far beyond the reach of either were the staggering social problems: periodic famine, epidemic disease, poverty, misery. In Fancheng, Hannah was appalled at the plight of the children. If a family couldn't marry off a baby girl, she'd be left outside the city to die.
A lot of them never had a choice, because a few hours after they were born, they were either brought out the side of the city gate or left on my mother's doorstep.
She took them home, raising them as her own children. They became Chester's sisters. When there were too many, she built an orphanage. She refused to allow the binding of feet, the centuries-old crippling of the Chinese woman. Hannah wrote home to her family in Iowa. We will never get used to the terrible sight of the bodies of little babies being dragged about by scavenger dogs. My sleep is filled with nightmares of suffering children. The work was taking its toll. Halva's concern was growing. He had built a cottage high in the mountains called Shi Liang, rest in the cool, where they escaped the endless work, the stifling heat. But it couldn't restore her health. Hannah was only 39 when she died.
I remember very vividly. Well, it was a crushing blow for the children. The Chinese loved her too, you know. Yes, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese that came to the funeral.
Hannah and Halva had built up the mission together. How could he carry on the work alone? Chester and Neelius were being sent to school with relatives in Iowa. Chester was 13 years old. His Chinese boyhood was behind him. Halva remained behind. It would take a year to turn the China mission over to others. On their trip, the boys survived a typhoon, a shipwreck, and an outbreak of smallpox, only to arrive in San Francisco in the wake of the devastating earthquake of 1906. At their first day at school in Iowa, they were treated as foreigners.
So the kids were all gathered around, waiting for us to come out. And they started to sing, "Ching Chong Cham," and eat dead rats, chew them up like ginger snaps. we felt so terrible.
But they weren't to stay long. Thousands of Americans were heading north to homestead in the Canadian West. This was the new land of opportunity. A year and a half after Hannah's death, the family was reunited. Chester went to school in Bardo, a Norwegian farming community near Camrose. The province of Alberta was just 3 years old.
This is the spot where my brother and I became Canadians. This is the site of the old Bardo School. And I remember the first fall that we were here. There was snow had fallen, and we got into a quarrel about the United States and Canada. You see, we had been steeped in pro-American propaganda. They didn't call it that in those days, but that's what it was. And we despised Canadians who bowed down to the king. And so my brother and I started throwing snowballs after the Union Jack that was flying here. And boy, the Canadian Norwegian kids got angry at us, and they snowed us under, and properly so. That's why I say from that time on, we didn't dare to be Americans anymore, so we became cowardly Canadians.
Halva was the pastor of the community. He was also a farmer. He gave Chester his first horse, Sailor, to look after the cattle. But he was still a missionary at heart, and restless. In 1911, he persuaded 15 families to follow him on a great trek north to yet another frontier, the Peace River country. For Chester, age 16, it was a dream come true. A wilderness full of adventure, tall tales, and colorful characters. Their new home was the first house built in Valhalla, a home of the gods. The name Halva gave the community. Long before a church was built, Pastor Ronning conducted services from a tent.
Well, all the people sat down and we sang songs. We had a choir here, we had games, and we had a service where he preached a sermon. Good service. He took the text, of course, and branched out from the text, and perhaps sometimes he didn't get back.
My mother was a cowgirl. She was a beautiful rider. She knew how to handle a horse. I'd hoped that someday I could ride a horse as well as she did.
Chester became a farmer and a cowboy. He was now old enough to file for his own quarter section. He broke horses all through the district. He met his sweetheart, Inga Marie Horte, by claiming that he could break her father's stallion that no one else could ride. It was a remote district. They shot their own food. They built a one-room school but couldn't attract anyone to teach. Halva claimed that Chester was a born teacher. At the age of 17, he had a class of 30. But it was to change his life. He decided to become a teacher. He and Nelius went south to the Camrose College in the University of Alberta. They played in the orchestra. Nelius the trumpet, Chester the E-flat cornet. Nelius studied geology, Chester education. They shared a dream of returning to China to carry on their parents' work. Nelius as a missionary, Chester as a teacher. But it was 1917. The Great War raged in Europe. They enlisted and were hastily trained as pilots. Fortunately, before they got to the front, the war ended. Then, on a survey party on Great Slave Lake, Nelius was drowned. Chester would have to carry on the China mission alone. "60 years later, he visits the Valhalla School. Some of the students are great-grandchildren of the class he first taught.
Should I say something in Chinese to you? Okay. 一定恭喜两相好，三行四喜五亏六顺，七个跳七个跳七个跳，马匹马快的力满福寿。What was I doing? Right. Now can you say? 一、二、三、四、五。What's five? 五。Put out your Norwegian strooms. That's better. 六、七、八、九、四。一定恭喜两相好，三行四喜五亏六顺，七个跳七个跳七个跳，八匹马快的力满福寿。That last is that both your hands full of fingers is what? Good. You pass.
I'd like to fast forward it to the last scene of the film, but I forgot to take note of the time. Okay, 54:49. This final scene shows some shots of the Camrose Lutheran College, now Founders Hall. I think the filming was mostly done in 1978, and it's a really touching conclusion to the film.
Live until you're old. Learn until you're old. And there is still so much to learn. The Camrose College, where he was a student 70 years ago. He's 85 now.
No, you don't forget. You don't become insensitive just because of age. Being associated with students and young people keeps you young.
Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. Oh, my soul, praise Him, for He is thy health and salvation. All ye who live, bow to His temple, draw near. Joining that adoration.
Thank you. from poaching young diplomat.
So there's a taste of the film. The second part, of course, as many of you probably know, goes into his life as a politician and diplomat, some of the more famous aspects of his life. But I wanted to focus on the first part because it frames his life so much in teaching and education and his love for those things. So again, that quote, live until you're old, learn until you're old, and there's still so much to learn. I'm 36. I have a PhD. I've published academic articles and books. I've given talks all over North America and Europe. I teach on a campus of a major research institution, and often I feel like I know hardly anything. So I'm glad that Chester Ronning, even into his 80s, felt this way too. And even at the end of a remarkable life, right? He talks about at the end there how being with the young people at Camrose Lutheran College inspires him to still learn, to still be involved in the educational process. So we should always be learning, especially if we're educators. So some things that really stood out to me in this first part of the film and in Ronning's life in relation to his zeal for education. First, it was rooted in his childhood and the example of his parents. Note that Ronning's mother, Hannah Rorem, was the first person to offer formal education to women in Fancheng, at least in recent history, at least as far as they knew at that time. The Ronning's family mission in China was Christian and evangelical, to be sure, but its focus was education. And the purpose of that education, at least in part, was to facilitate social equality, to create opportunities for everyone, even the peasant farmers and the fishermen and the craftspeople in China's heartland. Ronning knew, also from an early age, that true learning requires understanding of many sides to a story. So one of my favorite parts to the film is when he's telling about being a school kid in Bardo, about how the Canadian kids pelted him with snowballs until he realized that there was another way to think about the United States and American exceptionalism and so on. Full disclosure, I'm an American, so this part hit particularly home with me. Although no one's pelted me with snowballs, but living in Canada for the last 8 years has taught me something about other sides to the story. I try to teach my students that the key to critical thinking is being able to understand and engage a number of different positions in relation to a particular issue or problem. In the end, you may disagree with positions other than your own, but you must be able to describe and compare and analyze all the options before you settle into any single position on an issue. In other words, it's okay to disagree as long as you understand the alternatives, but don't simply dismiss other positions out of hand. Ronning may have been wrong about certain aspects of Mao's China, for example. He was frequently criticized in the US and in Canada for having a rather rosy view of the Cultural Revolution and the PRC in the 60s and 70s. But what Ronning got absolutely right, and this goes for his advocacy for Chinese communism as well as his criticism of the Vietnam War, is that the American and Canadian governments did not acknowledge, let alone truly understand, the complexities of the histories and social situations in Eastern Asia in the mid-part of the 20th century. His peace mission to Vietnam, for instance, was doomed from the start because the US didn't want to hear from both sides. They weren't even interested. This stance, the US stance that is, was fundamentally opposed to Ronning's way of thinking, which was to hear and at least try to understand opposing views, and then to try to navigate some kind of middle ground, which was why he was such a successful and accomplished diplomat. He was passionate about his own position, for sure, but he certainly didn't dismiss any other views out of hand. And this is a sign, at least to me, of a great critical thinker and learner. So that was Chester Ronning then. cowboy and politician and diplomat, yes, but primarily an educator and lifelong learner. The work of our center today is modeled on this aspect of Roning's life, his devotion to active democratic education. When we bring scholars to Camrose to speak on particular issues, our aim is not to advocate necessarily for any one view, religious or otherwise. The point is to facilitate learning, a chance for us to learn from the visiting scholars and the scholars to learn from us, to aid in our collective understanding of how people live and act in the world today, especially with regard to religious beliefs and practices. In conjunction with a conference taking place in Edmonton next month, we are hosting 2 feminist theologians, one Muslim and one Christian. And we've invited these scholars here to share with us their perspectives and to dialogue about similarities and differences across these traditional theological divides. This is not, of course, to convince anyone of a particular brand of feminism or to prove that one religion is more or less feminist than the other, or anything like that. The point is to learn, to bring different perspectives into conversation with one another, and to figure out how we can live better with and among those whose positions might be different than our own. This is just one example of upcoming programming that's going to take place here at the center and that honors Roning's legacy and his devotion to learning. If you take a look at our fall schedule, and I believe there are some copies over there, if you haven't seen it, please grab one, take one with you. You'll see a number of other events like this one. And I'd like to close this morning by mentioning another initiative in the works that will have a great impact, I believe, on the center and on Augustana in the years to come. Thanks to generous support from the Wendy Cassidy Memorial Fund. Wendy Cassidy is a granddaughter-in-law of Chester Ronning. We'll be launching a postdoctoral program here at the center. So beginning next fall, the center will host a postdoctoral scholar whose primary task will be to organize a major international conference on a pressing issue related to religion and public life. The scholar will receive a 2-year appointment here at Augustana. In addition to organizing the conference, the scholar will also teach a course on the topic at hand, will lead conversation sessions or workshops for students and community members, and will help produce a publication as an outgrowth of the work. And I've noted here, I'm in talks right now with the University Press at the University of Alberta. I'm really hoping that the publication program we develop in relation to this program, postdoc program, will be open access, meaning that all of the publications will be freely, easily available electronically to anyone who has internet access around the globe. And this is to honor Roning's devotion and also my own commitment to public education, to democratic education. The postdoc program will become a kind of hub for the center's programming. It will enable us to learn from and interact with a young, vibrant scholar of religion. It will provide a theme of focus around which we can develop interrelated programming over a 24-month period. And it will afford the postdoc an opportunity to begin their career right here at Augustana, which will leave a great impression, I'm sure, just as this institution has had an impression on all of you and on me, which is why we're here this morning for Alumni Weekend. But the big picture, the main aim of the program, is to build on the lesson of Roning's life, to bring together and learn from different points of view, including those of scholars, religious leaders, students, community members, and others right here in Camrose. So thank you for joining us this morning. I thank you for your support of the center and our campus, and I look forward to getting to know each of you better and to know some of you that I haven't had a chance to meet yet, and I hope that you'll be able to attend some of our events this fall and winter. It's close to 10 o'clock. Because, as I said, probably some of you are better experts on Ronning than myself. We won't have a question and answer time, but feel free to stay, say hello, catch up with your classmates. There are probably more refreshments over there. And please, if you're able, remember 10:30, Reverend Wentland will be leading a worship service in the chapel. So thank you all for coming and have a good morning.